Okay, hello everybody, and welcome back to the Counterweight podcast. I'm one of the hosts here, Mike, and I'm joined by my co-host Elizabeth Spivak. And today we are talking to Niel Thin. Niel, I wonder if you could give yourself a very brief introduction.
So I have been until this week a senior lecturer at the University of Edinburgh. My home discipline is social anthropology, but I lecture and research and do outreach work across a big variety of disciplines. The common element in recent years has been well-being and happiness, particularly the social dimensions of that, and looking at how personal well-being and personal happiness pursuits interact with cultural settings, with social structures, and so on. Before that, I worked internationally for 20 years as an international development consultant, combining that with academic work, but worked in lots of different countries, promoting social planning that was focused on human rights and the removal of poverty. And now I am retired, but I am a research fellow at the University of Edinburgh.
Okay, very good. So let's get this ball rolling. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that we could talk to you about, Niel, that would be very pertinent to this podcast. So hopefully we can have you back in the future to talk about various topics. But let's talk about, there was a kind of exchange that was going on Twitter recently. And I thought that you posed a really good question. At least I think it was you that posed this question. And that's this. So I'm going to read it out. So why do so many people condemn the inquisitors of the past while endorsing or turning a blind eye to the mobbing of contemporary heretics? Any thoughts there?
That sounds familiar, though I never really remember my tweets and don't review them as much as I should. But that's
it may not have been you.
Familiar. It's interesting how the topic, I'd never in a million years have thought that I would suddenly get interested in my later life in the concept of heresy. And now suddenly, I suppose as a result of a number of engagements with cancel culture debate, I'm very interested in heresy, what it means, what's good about being a heretic, why some people choose heresy, why some have it thrust upon them, whether certain kinds of viewpoints are recognized as heretical or just dismissed as offensive or nasty or misguided or whatever.
So one of the connections that Mike had made was to Bradley and Manning's victimhood seeking morality. And I was very interested in both of this is not my field as much as it is both of yours, this idea that we've transitioned historically from a culture of honor and dignity. So those probably coexist fairly nicely. Now to maybe what Bradley and Manning called a culture of victimhood. I've heard some people suggest that a culture of empathy is a better name for it. I don't know how you feel about that.
I think maybe we should... I was going to say, I think maybe we should pass the what the dignity culture is, what the honor culture is, first of all. I'm quite comfortable to do that. Okay, so the idea of an honor-based culture would be a culture in which your personal honor is kind of sacred and in many ways quite fragile. So, for example, if somebody were to, in the parlance of modern street gangs, for example, diss you or insult the honor of your lady, perhaps in the Wild West of America, then you were kind of obliged to rectify that, often by demanding an apology. And then if you didn't get that apology, or if the apology wasn't sufficient, it would then be satisfied with physical violence. Often you can hear the term, I demand satisfaction, sir, or something like that. And so your dignity was always sacred and you had to protect it according to whatever means in this honor-based system. The dignity culture that you move on with, and Niel, you might know this better than me, being a professional anthropologist. But as far as I understand it, the dignity culture is the kind of this sticks and stones may hurt my bones, but words will never harm me. Now, as a description of reality, that statement's fairly useless because, of course, as we all know, words can be extremely traumatic. They can lead to shunning and alienation, and all the kind of pain that we've all experienced as presenters and guests here, but also a lot of our audience will have experienced. So we know that words and phrases can do absolutely immense damage. But the phrase itself is not really useful as a description of reality, but as a moral compass. So the idea is that there is this dignified part of you that should remain immune, or at least aspire to being immune to external insults, and so you don't demand satisfaction. You try and be a tough somebody who can endure, somebody who isn't fragile, and you kind of soldier on through with this innate dignity. Moving on to the victimhood culture. The victimhood culture is this idea of a culture in which the real damage, to steal man it, the real damage that words and phrases can do to you is understood, is put to the forefront, and is seen as something that must be addressed. Not so much in the honor culture. In the honor culture, that would be addressed by you. You would be the one demanding satisfaction. You would be the one who would be prepared to engage in physical violence in order to protect your honor or your dignity. But in the victimhood seeking culture, it's more about you're trying to co-opt authority in order to protect you. So social status is achieved by either being a victim, and you could be a real victim here, or you might be a bogus victim, but so long as you can convince people you're a victim, or by seeing to intercede on behalf of either real victims or bogus victims. Anything to add to that, Niel? Have I got that more or less right?
Yes. So, I mean, I think in the modern era, victimhood is the new kind of sanctification that leads to a heresy, because if you criticize any aspect of the identity or practice or actions of people who belong in a sanctified category, and they're sanctified because they're believed to be vulnerable or fragile, powerless, disadvantaged, or whatever. If you then question anything about them, you become a heretic, because sanctification involves putting people and categories beyond all question. The trouble is that in any kind of moral discourse worth its while, that's going to backfire, because if people are so victimized that they can't defend themselves against argument, that they can't defend their own dignity, then they are essentially being dehumanized by that sanctification. So if my identity is beyond challenge, beyond criticism, I'm not fully human. And so the victimological discourse leads to as the common phrase used for this is the bigotry of low expectations. It leads to extremely patronizing attitudes towards people that are put in those victim categories. And by the way, a lot of serious intellectuals who belong in victimized categories fight back against this, and quite rightly so. They say, I don't want to be called a victim. I don't want to be put beyond question. I don't want to be someone who can't be criticized. So intelligent people that belong in those categories will fight back against that ideology, but they then become heretics themselves.
Because I guess for the three of us coming largely from a dignity-based moral culture, right? Like when we look at these people who are being infantilized by this discourse, it does seem to strip away dignity from these people. And then this is the experience I've had with ethnic minority colleagues at work, pretty much all of whom have absolutely rejected this victimhood ideology for precisely the reasons that you outline, and they find it very demeaning, making them heretics.
And as you mentioned, it's sort of a reliance on third parties to, whether it's authorities or social media or whatever, to validate you. And, a sort of an abandonment of the sort of the strength and honor culture, or the inner worth or dignity culture, for this culture of relying on others to value us. And if they don't value us enough, then we are victims. So support goes to people who lack privilege, but the ability to attract support is sort of a privilege in and of its own. So this is, Bradley and Manning, a reduction in oppression comes from being recognized as being oppressed, and you have to be recognized by these third parties. It's not about, your own personal dignity or sense of honor.
Yes, and I think a useful observation on dignity culture is that dignity would be a wonderful concept if it was just about basic respect for every human as a human being. The trouble with dignity culture, it's never been a way of validating all humans, or very rarely so. Mike, you referred to the culture of people defending their honor in duels. Well, they were the people who were obsessed about their status rather than just about their dignity. In the era when those kinds of duels flourished, there was an extreme hierarchy, and you only needed to defend your dignity if you were already at the top of the hierarchy. Everyone else, no one else counted. So most humans in that culture were not expected to have dignity. And I think there's a kind of inverted version of that today. If you can claim belonging in one of several so-called intersectional victimhood categories, in at least one of those, you become worthy, worth defending. But if you don't belong in one of those, if you're, like me, for example, old white male privileged, then your right to dignity is actually in the activists' minds is not interesting.
Nor is your right to defend. Nor is your right to defend your honor.
Yeah.
Right. We cannot defend our honor, and we have no sort of inner worth anymore. The inner worth is not what's important. Again, they would say, well, others don't value you, so therefore you are valueless.
Yeah.
Right. And so, when the mob comes and they've decided that you're not valuable, then you're not, and that's the end of that. And it's very difficult to maintain that sense of inner worth and of honor on your own, in your own private life, when that's happening.
One of the big tragedies that strikes me about this is that people can suffer, people can be at extreme disadvantage in a number of ways that wouldn't necessarily be immediately obvious, right? That people may not pick up on, and because they suffer from a disadvantage in those ways, they might not want to be fully open about them suffering in that kind of way. Do you see what I mean? So, for example, if somebody was on the spectrum, a little bit on the spectrum, a little bit autistic, we know how much of a disadvantage that would be for that person in their lives, right? And then that person may, for the whole of their lives, really, really wanted nothing more than to fit in, and have worked really, really, really hard to fit in, and got to perhaps a point where, generally speaking, people might notice them as being a bit eccentric, but they pass, they pass as normal, and that's a sense of achievement for them. And then that same person, for example, might, because people who are on the spectrum sometimes can be accidentally rude. They might think that they're being polite. They might think that they're being perfectly personable, but they might accidentally come across as being rude because they're not as socially skilled, naturally speaking, as normal people are. They might then be accused of a microaggression and then hammered by a mobbing of a cancel mob. And not feel comfortable about talking about their own disadvantages. So it's very, very arbitrary, the way in which these I don't know, these categories of group of oppressed are made, I think.
Yes, I mean there was an interesting case of that. I'm sure it's come across it happened in lots of places, but I remember a case from Oxford University about 5 or 6 years ago, just in the early days of when UK universities were beginning to take an interest in microaggressions, and Oxford wanted to get a little bit ahead of the curve, and so it put out a list of microaggressions that students should avoid, and it included, if you avoid eye contact, that's a microaggression. And of course, quite rightly, disability activists then pointed out that actually, for certain kinds of people, eye contact is a terrifying thing, and you shouldn't diss somebody for avoiding eye contact. And so it goes on. I mean, and this is the trouble with victimological competitions, is no one's ever ultimately going to win, because somebody else is going to claim a different kind of victimhood and try to trump you with that.
I think advocates of this kind of morality, though, don't or can't acknowledge that they might be harming anyone who's not worthy of harm, right? Mm-hmm. So, not everyone can be the kind of victim that's required for this kind of morality. I don't know. I think that they don't really see how anyone else could be victimized. It's very, very, I don't know. They own the decision.
There's an interesting way around this, I think, that I try sometimes. I'm not sure I always am very successful with this idea, but I think it's worth pursuing, which is that rather than having conversations about who is more victimized and who is harmed by what kinds of speech, we should think of the social quality, our social environment, as something really worth protecting and cherishing, because we all, our minds don't just live inside our heads, right? Our minds live in the social ether. We exist through our relationships, not just through our personal choices and actions. And so everybody has a common interest in looking after the social environment, just as we have a common interest in checking that our water supply isn't polluted and that our air quality is breathable. And I think if you shift to that more neutral territory, there is some potential for taking some of the battle out of these conversations and helping people recognize that actually, for example, if you push too hard on microaggressions, you may not just harm particular individuals, like somebody who's just trying to be polite and is wrongly told off for asking somebody an innocent question, but that you harm the social quality, and the social quality is something everybody should protect. So if you end up with a culture of suspicion, a culture of worry about potential microaggressions, then your social quality is ruined. Whereas if you have a culture where relaxed joking is okay, there's a default expectation that people at least respect each other, if not love one another. If that's the default expectation in a given social environment, people are far more likely to flourish. So I think just to come back to what I originally said, I think there's mileage in the idea that if we want to look for better social futures, we try to steer conversations away from categories of people harming other categories of people, and rather steer the conversation towards our collective responsibility for making our social environments as convivial as we can.
I think that's a good transition to talking about the book that you wrote, Social Wellbeing, and and why you decided to write that book. Could you just tell us real quickly what motivated you to write that book? I think I know, but I think you'll do a better job of describing it.
I think it's a reasonably simple book. I had lots of points when I was writing it. I worried it was too simple, but it is an academic book. And there are kind of two streams of thought that go into it. One, which has been with me for a very, very long time, many decades, which is a sense of unease with my home discipline of anthropology in particular, with sociology, social policy, most of the social sciences, which is basically that there are two pathological. The modern social sciences grew up in the 19th century essentially as critiques of social ills, of the social ills of modernity. So the modern social sciences took their lead from the idea that we shouldn't be triumphalist about Western progress, and that there were lots of new inequalities, new forms of harm, new social pollutions that came from the Industrial Revolution and beyond. Now, that's all very well to make those critiques, but if the whole discipline is all about looking for trouble, then it can't really call itself sociology or social anthropology. It's really social pathology. That's all that you're doing. And most social scientists are essentially social pathologists. So that's the one stream, which is like a kind of social version of the positive psychology movement, which likewise recognized that the discipline of psychology had grown up to look at mental pathologies rather than to look at the mind in general. The other stream is addressing, for example, the positive psychologists and the happiness philosophers and happiness promoters, is that too much of that discourse, positive psychology, self-help culture, life coaching, promotion of personal happiness, far too much of that presumes that well-being comes from the individual person, and that each individual is solely responsible for their own well-being. And we know that that's not true, because we evolved as a highly social species, and therefore our identities, our existence, our well-being happens in social space, not just in mental space, not just inside our heads. So, and that's where the phrase social well-being, I sometimes use the phrase social happiness. I don't think they're very difficult to understand, but to some people they sound surprising because people think of well-being and happiness as a private matter.
I read in the foreword to the book that you were worried that, I think this is a quote, that many more people worldwide will be forced back into remedial mode because of the pandemic. So the people who might be reading the book when it was released, focusing on survival and basic needs rather than on more positive aspects of the good life. And I wonder now, I don't know exactly when you wrote that foreword and where you were in terms of your what happened on campus. But I wonder where you see that now, looking back. Do you think that people were forced back into remedial mode, focused more on survival, or? Well, I'll let you.
So it's very hard to generalize, and I being a person of extreme privilege, I only have one particular perspective on this. But I think it went in both directions. So on the one hand, we, of course, now, since then, we've also faced the double whammy of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the economic crisis in Europe and beyond. So things may get an awful lot worse. But it's amazing how well we survived the pandemic. And looking at the brighter side, of course, a lot of people responded to the pandemic by looking to what's valuable in life, by adopting a more appreciative gaze. So perhaps these traumas have kind of divided us. So those who were able to swim and respond constructively have found new meaning in life. And I think I don't know the statistics, but certainly in European countries, there are a lot of reports of people for very positive reasons taking early retirement, much as I've just done, for mainly positive reasons, because the pandemic showed them what was really valuable in their lives, and that they hadn't before then had the time or the opportunity to really reflect. So at the very least, the pandemic offered a moment of collective reflection on what's good in life, what's valuable in life, that allowed some people to become more appreciative and more aspirational. But probably for the overwhelming majority of humanity, the effects are pretty harmful and will make the struggle to survive more dominant than it was before. Whereas if we wind the clock back to the 1990s, we had the Asian financial crash and then the global financial crash just round the corner. But at that point, humanity's living conditions had improved so dramatically over the past 50 years that a massively increased portion of humanity were able to live aspirationally, playing to their strengths, looking for what's wonderful in life, rather than just looking to avoid abject misery.
But there's no doubt, right, that the pandemic contributed to the victim, the sort of expansion of the victimhood morality and the ideological divides. Yeah,
it definitely did, and I think for the overwhelming majority it did. But it also opened up I think what I'm saying is it also opened up new spaces for thinking outside the box, thinking outside the norm. I gave a talk right in the early stages of the pandemic, reflecting on what kinds of good might come from it. And I called it our Kintsugi moment, using the Japanese concept of Kintsugi, which Mike can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I roughly understand it to be based on the iconic image of a broken pot that you mend with gold lines so that it looks even more beautiful and interesting than it already did. So you take a catastrophe and you make something good out of it, and I don't think we should lose that aspect of the outcomes from the pandemic. However, having said that, I would not expect in the next couple of years if I look in sociology and anthropology and social policy journals, I will expect to see all of them, or nearly all of the articles that write about the pandemic, focusing on the grim side.
Did Niel have it right, Mike?
He did. Sadly, it's not something that's generally practiced much in Japan, certainly not in a widespread sense anymore. It's a very kind of throw things away culture, buy everything new again. Mm. Like one of the big tragedies about Japan is that you see these beautiful old houses that could be renovated, and you look at them, they're a bit dilapidated, but you're like, wow, the structure's there, isn't it wonderful? Renovate it, do something new with it. And they just tear it down and replace it with something that's obviously infinitely more functional, but just completely soulless. And so that there's that. It's funny. There's a Japanese, an Anglo-Japanese. I think it was actually Irish American or something like that. A guy called Lafcadio Hearn, and he came to Japan towards the end of the 19th century, and detailed this kind of Japan that doesn't really exist anymore. So the concept's correct. I'm sure there is some lingering aspect of that within modern Japan, but not nearly enough, I'm afraid. But good use of concept anyway.
It's definitely alive and well in Niel, who
yes.
in the couple of years that we've known him, this is definitely a theme, and it's the way in which you, Niel, have taken the pieces of many broken pots and made them into something more beautiful, I think has been inspirational, for me. And you even took what had happened to you at the university and segued into an interdisciplinary project, right? And I haven't had an update on that. I would love to hear. You were interested in curiosity, and you were working with people across campus to try to get something started.
Yeah. Well, there's a phrase that springs to mind actually now that you mentioned that, and I can't remember the name of the poet for the moment. There's a Welsh poet who produced this, remember for many phrases, but one of aphorisms, and one of them was the best revenge is to live well. You know, if society has harmed you, or if somebody has harmed you, or an institution has done you down, you can sit around and bemoan your lot, or you can just decide to pick up the pieces and live better as a result. Now, not everyone can do that. If you've been really harmed, you might be traumatized for life. We shouldn't pretend that bad stuff doesn't happen. But equally, it seems quite important as a matter of basic principles for life that when really bad stuff happens, you try however hard you can to find a way of weaving that into the story of your life. One of the things that we used to discuss a lot in my courses on happiness, which I think provides an interesting link between the psychological happiness and social happiness, is that when the more we talk about happiness, the more we tend to think of it as something that goes beyond happy moments, just a heap of happy moments, and the more we think of it as a story of a life going well, a biographical narrative. But life stories, biographical narratives happen interactively. You know, you don't develop your own autobiography entirely on your own. It's built up through relationships, and you try your stories out on other people. So when bad stuff happens to an individual, the best predictor, and lots of research has backed this out, the best predictor of whether somebody is likely to experience post-traumatic growth comes from whether or not they received social support during the days when they were really struggling. And certainly personally, I can attest to that. I've led an incredibly charmed life most of my days, but I did have some trouble last year, as you know, that I got embroiled in some pretty nasty cancel culture stuff from my own university. It was a real shock to my system. But social support from students, friends, from some colleagues was absolutely crucial in me sort of turning what might just have been nothing but gloom and misery into, I now see it already, I think, as an interesting chapter in my life. It doesn't mean to say I'm not traumatized. I am still a bit traumatized. I wake up very angry at night. But I think it's turning into an interesting new chapter in my life. Who knows where it's going to lead, but I'm very, very happy with how it's going right now. And I think, on a collective level, my message about the pandemic and responding to that is, of course, the pandemic was horrific. It was a real shock to our cultural and social systems. And the financial shocks were felt probably for generations to come. But in many countries and many communities, new networks of social support evolved, new ways of interacting and doing business evolved. There are lots of positive outcomes that we could count if we were of the mindset that we count our blessings and move on.
I wonder if this might be a good time. I mentioned in our little pre-podcast talk that I wanted to talk about gross national happiness. I had never heard of this before, and this idea of the well-being of all living things. And I think that you've been talking about the collective good, right? Which is sort of, I think, what GNH is. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that.
So gross national happiness has a kind of very general meaning, which is it's just a kind of loose rubric for what the United Nations called, the purpose of development, which is to basically maximize human happiness. It also has a more specific cultural history located in the tiny kingdom of Bhutan, which is this less than 1 million people living in a tiny enclave in the Himalayas, sandwiched between India and China. And until the 1970s, they largely kept themselves to themselves, didn't do much international trade, didn't engage much in international politics. They just tried to keep their heads down and keep out of trouble. But as a result, were on lots of objective measures pretty financially and infrastructurally backward, also educationally, medically, in all kinds of ways. So they decided in the 1970s that they wanted to grasp some of the benefits of modern development. They wanted to trade, they wanted to grow their economy, but they also wanted to do it on their own terms. And so when the new young, he was only 16 years old, when the new young king was asked by a slightly patronizing Indian journalist on national TV or radio, I can't remember which, what can you, a 16-year-old in a tiny country like Bhutan, hope to do for gross national product? And so his response was, well, that's not really what we value. What we value is gross national happiness. So it was a kind of a joke, a quip, a kind of comeback, but it took on a life of its own, and Bhutan became a kind of beacon of hope for the rest of the world as an example of a country that decided to do what had been advocated 300 years before during the Enlightenment, which was make happiness the core value, the core purpose of our institutions, the core evaluative criterion. So very interesting rhetoric, but it's been much abused. So romantics who love to sort of be rude about modernity and be rude about the West and so on will pounce on it as an example of, oh, Bhutan is this wonderful country that has its values right and the rest of us have got it wrong. But actually, for the Bhutanese living in poverty, their best route to happiness was actually to help the economy grow so that they could pay for education systems, medical systems, infrastructure, and so on. So actually, what many people don't know about Bhutan is it was actually one of the world's fastest growing economies, albeit from a very low base, through the 70s and 80s, the very years in which everyone was busy applauding it for making happiness its central goal. But anyway, it got a lot of help from an interest from outside parties, and it became we established a panel of, I think, about 70 individuals from various countries around the world who were regularly in touch with the Bhutanese government to try and to put some bones in this, and they've come up with, I think, a very nice model for essentially a very well-rounded form of governance, which doesn't make the economy its sole central plank, which looks at things like personal fulfillment, cultural values, social quality, educational attainment, and so on. And it uses that to measure development in a reasonably holistic way. So I think it's going in a good direction insofar as it does that.
Well, one of the things you mentioned, I think that Mike could maybe speak to this a little bit, is sort of, especially living in two cultures, right? Being a Brit, living in Japan now, and sort of immersing yourself in that culture and language. The difference in how maybe Westerners and Easterners define culture, define happiness, and Niel touched on it a little bit, but I think you might have a unique perspective.
Yeah. Okay. So I think in the West people mistake happiness and pleasure. They think that they're exactly the same thing, right? So, for example, if I was to say, "What makes you happy?" I have to say, look, I'm extremely naive in this topic compared to Niel, obviously, who's made his career out of this, but I have some probably fairly superficial musings. If I was to say, well, what makes you happy? Sometimes my students would say, going to Disneyland. Going to Disneyland is great, it's fun, but it strikes me that it's not the going to Disneyland so much that makes them happy, it's more and this is kind of drawing on Epicurus here, it's more the kind of the social interaction. They're going with their friends, they're experiencing these activities that are fun with their friends, but that the happiness isn't where they think it is. They think the happiness is in Disneyland, and certainly Disneyland, the attractions are accentuating the happiness, absolutely, and they're designed to do that and do a very good job of it. But fundamentally, the happiness is actually driven by the social interactions that they're having. There are some things that I notice. I mean, that's a mistake that's made in Japan, and that's a mistake that's made in the UK and America, and probably most everywhere else, certainly China, in which you think, for example, that shopping's going to make you happy, and you will get that kind of probably dopamine kick when you try on an outfit that looks really cool, but it doesn't last very long. But again, the real happiness seems to be in the socializing. So we miss that in the West. They miss that in the East too. One of the things that I think, and I'm going to be careful who I'm speaking for here. Certainly, there's a whole literature on this, but certainly one of the things that the Japanese have that we don't have, that I suspect the South Koreans have and the Chinese have as well, but I'm not sure because there are big differences between these cultures, is this sense of in order for you to be happy, in order for you to have this sense of well-being, this kind of eudaimonia, I think, is that right? The Greeks used to call it, is you have to suffer. And so within Japanese culture, two of the most important words are gamansuru, which roughly translates as endurance, and gambaro, which roughly translates as perseverance. And if you spend any time listening to Japanese conversations, being in Japan, watching Japanese, if you put on an Japanese anime, or you read Japanese manga and you put the subtitles in so you can hear the language, you're always going to hear gambaro, 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 persevere, persevere, persevere. And it is understood in Japan that is a prerequisite to this notion of happiness, right? So, for example, if you look at a Western hero versus a Japanese hero. A Japanese hero, the classic one from probably the most successful Japanese manga comic book series, but also anime. That series is called One Piece, and it's a pirate drama. And the leader of this small ragtag group of pirates who are the protagonists of the show is this guy called Luffy. And when you see Luffy getting into a fight with one of the enemies, it's so different to how you would see a Western hero. So you think about A Fistful of Dollars. Do you know that movie? The classic Clint Eastwood movie. And he strolls into the town. He's like, "Get 3 coffins ready." And then the bad guys come out, and he effortlessly just smokes all of them, and they all die. And he's still got the cigarillo hanging from his lips, and he strolls back off and he sees the Undertaker and says, "My mistake 4," or something like that. And it's all so effortless, and it's all about his talent and his ability. There's no real struggle there. There's no real effort. Compare that to what we see in Japan. So Luffy, there's a classic episode it's not one episode, it's actually a series of episodes in which Luffy, this pirate hero, gets into a big fight with this enemy who's literally a god. He's called the god Eneru. And the battle goes on for, I can't remember, but at least 7 episodes. And throughout at least those 7 episodes, Luffy is trying his best to fight this guy, and this guy is just like laughing, like and easily swiping away his blows and just hammering him. And it's going through episodes of this guy, this pirate who's the hero, just being absolutely annihilated with the greatest of ease by an opponent who is clearly stronger than him. And so what it's emphasizing, and again, I'm using this as an example, but there is a literature on this in cross-cultural psychology. What it emphasizes is Luffy has to endure. He has to gamansuru in Japanese over and over again. He has to go through all of this pain, and he has to keep persevering. He has to keep trying to fight back. As much as the guy laughs at him and fails, that's okay. He gets up and he tries to fight back. And he just loses again and again and again and again. Then about 7 or 8 episodes in, there's this final crushing blow from this god character. And Luffy is then knocked into a daze. And he goes into this dream and he imagines himself with his nakama, his crew, on his pirate ship, and suddenly, by drawing on this, what you call in Japanese ishoni, which is this spirit of togetherness, where you do something, this kind of touches on what Niel was saying earlier, you do something not for yourself, but for your crew, for your nakama, for your team, your society, your group. Then, once he's animated by that spirit of togetherness, suddenly he can fight back, and suddenly he turns around the fight and he wins. So that seems to be missing increasingly, I think, from the West. This idea that in order to, and I kind of, happiness is such a confused term, but in order to flourish as a human being, it's very, very well understood in Japan that it's impossible. You can't really do it without having to endure a lot and without persevering against really, really, really strong adversity. And so this is kind of baked into the Japanese national spirit that you have to endure and that you should expect to do it against adversity. Yeah.
So I think it's very interesting using East-West contrasts as a way of exploring radically different perspectives on happiness. What I'm a bit wary of is endorsing the kind of North American psychology approach, which is to draw these big oppositions between Western individualism and Eastern collectivism, between Western self-enhancement, naive pursuit of pleasure versus Eastern welcoming of balance and noting that the good life involves suffering. Because actually, I think in all cultures, people embrace a bit of a mix of values, a bit of both. I mean, coming from the UK, for example, I was just thinking when you were talking about weaving suffering into the narrative of a well-lived life. There's a rather lovely autobiography by an author who clearly has suffered immensely in her life, called Jeanette Winterson, called "Why Be Happy When You Could Be Normal," which is a phrase from her rather brutal mother, who gave her a rather rough upbringing. And she has this pair of metaphors for two different models of the well-lived life. One is bovine happiness, which is basically just being content and munching and chewing the cud and not wanting anything more. That's one route to a certain kind of quiet happiness. But another route to happiness that is more interesting and is more story-like is the salmon's route to happiness, because it involves travel, and travel involves immense struggle against almost insurmountable obstacles. So she says if she wants to valorize her own life, she would have to choose the happiness of the salmon, which is a life of endless struggle, but nonetheless interesting and with its little triumphs over adversity along the way.
There is personal achievement even in Mike's story, right? So the hero or heroine is still searching. I mean, still does smite the villain in the end, certainly with the help of some community. But there's still that same satisfaction that Clint Eastwood gets, right? And so I think you're right. We need all kinds of happiness. We need that immediate happiness, and we need the happiness of the collective. And in a long time ago, maybe I can link it in the podcast in podcast notes, because I'm not going to maybe say this very well, but we did share an article amongst ourselves about the Stasi of Nazi Germany and the current. So it's not gross national happiness that they're measuring, but they are measuring measures similar to that and of GDP. And what they found was the researchers found was in the areas where there was a lot of sort of ratting out of their neighbors, right? So and in contiguous communities of where there was a lot of informing going on neighbors and shopkeepers and that kind of thing. There is currently still today, lower employment, more violence, more suspicion. So sort of elements that would indicate low gross national happiness in those areas even today. So I think that this sort of ability to recognize that community will contribute not just in sort of a short term to our happiness today, but will contribute to the happiness of future generations. Maybe the future lives of people that we don't know and that we may not have any personal connection to. And so I think that that's, the study is very complicated in terms of mathematical information systems kind of work. So I'm not doing a very good job of explaining the study, but there were definitely long-term risks to sort of pitting people against each other, as opposed to figuring out how what we have in common and how we want to work together for this sort of gross national happiness in addition to our own personal short-term happiness.
And again, what's terrifying about stories about situations like the Stasi stories, and I heard similar stories in Rwanda about the sort of culture of extreme hatred and suspicion that was quite deliberately and manipulatively cultivated, is that it's possible to imagine people going through that and then seeing something better and feeling enriched, but it's quite hard to imagine any kind of sense of flourishing in a society where the social quality is as divisive and explosive as that.
Or as this.
Yes.
Or as
so
this.
I think it's kind of very, as
well,
this. So I think that this kind of naturally leads on to the following question. The best available evidence seems to show that the critical social justice advocates, those who either really believe in it or, I don't know, cynically go along with it for personal gain, are quite an extreme minority. Most of them no more than 10 or 11% of the population. However, we also know that even though they're probably a minority in places like academia, the social media companies, legacy media, probably a minority there, they nevertheless hold sway. And we get this kind of panopticon, do you know what I mean? Where like we're all kind of trying to adjust our behavior to suit these people's whims, thinking that they're watching us all of the time, and we never really know whether they are or they're not. So let's say then that the critical social justice advocates, the woke mob, if you want to call them that, let's say if they win and they manage to completely dominate society for the next 10 years, what then do you think the prognosis would be for the gross national happiness, for example, of those countries in which they really dominated? What would the consequences be?
Well, I clearly think that bad forms of social activism, divisive forms, suspicion-mongery, fear-mongery, competitive victimology, they're bad for all of us, and perhaps particularly bad for the supposed victims of these unfair social hierarchies. So the potential for a small number of activists to do a tremendous amount of harm really does need to be taken seriously. I'm not a cultural pessimist or generally a social pessimist, as you can probably tell. I always try to look on the bright side, but there are grounds for it, given how social movements that appeared to be a kind of weird corner of academia 10, 15 years ago are now very, very mainstream in all the kinds of organizations you just mentioned. How did they get there, given that it's a fair hunch, I think, that only a tiny minority really believe in the beliefs that these movements are spreading? They got there. It comes back to the question of heresy. Once they had succeeded in persuading people to believe that certain kinds of opinion were heretical and that certain kinds of categories of people were sacred, it then is very hard for any individual to see it as in their interest, their long-term interest, to be a heretic, to question the ideology. So there's a real problem of sort of social dilemma here. Everyone probably, if you take the example of divisive race talk. I think just about everybody knows that race was a fundamentally bad human idea that's had a terrible history, and that we're all better off without race talk. But given that the activists have made it a heretical view to deny, to say, let's not talk about race anymore, they've basically cancelled that view. It's in nobody's interest to stick their heads up and say, hang on a minute, I don't think we should bother talking about race anymore, because race talk is divisive, it's ugly, it pits us against one another. So until a critical mass of individuals are prepared to buck that trend and face up to that problem, you've got a social dilemma. The same as you did, for example, with, take another example of social dilemma is clothing in the workplace, restrictive clothing. Lots of workplaces until very recently had extraordinarily strict and stupid dress codes, so that even in extreme hot weather, men had to wear, suits, sometimes three-piece suits with shirts and ties, and women had to wear whatever they had to wear that they weren't necessarily comfortable with. It takes a brave person to challenge that in a workplace, but if a critical number of people show up to work without their suits and ties, or they organize themselves and say, hang on a minute, we're all better off just wearing shorts and a t-shirt, at least in hot weather. Until that happens, no one is going to want to change things. And I think that's the situation we are in with critical social justice ideologies, is people are just quite rightly very scared to challenge them.
One of the things we've been talking about in all of our interviews is, two things that are related to everything we've talked about today. One is, playing the long game, and that, I think that's very related to what we've been talking about, and looking long term at how we can make changes, and this little sort of popping your head up and stuff over, looking for opportunities to do that, not necessarily on a daily basis or right when something happens, but looking at the long term. And then the other is making connections. And so, how do we make connections with like-minded people, or how do we prepare for perhaps being canceled and feeling so very alone and confused, and the way that it changes your perspective on the world. And maybe, I don't know that you can actually prepare for that in any way, but to find connections. So I'm wondering if you have any suggestions on either one of those fronts, either on playing the long game or in how to, sort of build a community, figure out, because your friends will abandon you, right?
Yes.
The people that you think are your friends. So
yeah,
building
that is the awful truth of the treatment of whistleblowers and heretics, is that even people who can see exactly what is happening, they still don't see it as in their interest to stand up and say solidarity with X. And even a case as high profile as Salman Rushdie, he's been a heretic for 89 sort of well over 30 years now, prominent heretic. And of course, lots of people have come out and condemned the recent attack on him, but there are plenty of other people who don't. They just don't think it's a personal risk that we're taking. They can't see that actually it's in the collective social interest for everybody to condemn an attack like that, and for everybody to look out for other sources of attacks on innocent individuals. So what's the positive message? Well, I think despite what everybody says about social media do provide spaces where people can get in touch with strangers, and if they play their cards right, can gradually develop a sort of sense of trust, with a sense of intimacy with distant strangers. And so I do my best on Twitter. I have a tiny following, but I have mainly extremely pleasant interactions on Twitter that have become a kind of, a small but significant part of my social life. I don't use other social media, so I can't really speak for them, but it seems to be any medium has the potential for being a cesspit of hatred and aggression and mistrust, but also the potential, if you understand how it works, to look for the right people to engage with, to ignore the people who are just there as troublemakers, and to build social capital and build social networks and build understanding. So I think that in terms of educational terms, I think educational institutions have an important duty to encourage young people to try out a variety of different social media and a variety of different ways of using social media, just as we do encourage them to try out different arguments in their essays, different lines of argument in class debates and so on. I think we should be encouraging them to use social media intelligently to build a sense of understanding across cultural divides and across disciplinary divides and across the geography of the world.
Are you still involved with Don't Divide Us?
Yes, so they're a really nice example. I mean, I actually was engaged with them before I fell victim to cancel culture. I had spotted their existence, and I had occasionally engaged with them on Twitter and retweeted their stuff and used their hashtag. They have a very, very clear, no-nonsense message. I've argued with the organizers that the message could be more positive, because don't divide us as a start, but it's remedial, it's kind of anti-divisiveness. But as I argued in my social well-being book, being anti things is not good enough. We need to be more aspirational than that. So I will keep on saying to an organization like Don't Divide Us, or for example, many other organizations that have been in touch with me over the past year, free speech organizations, free speech likewise, it's a start, but all it really alludes to is an escape from unfreedom, that we need to aspire to something more positive than that. But yeah, organizations like these, I've got in touch with through social media. I didn't have to leave.
There's a wonderful passage.
Sorry?
There's a wonderful passage from Nietzsche in Thus Spoke Zarathustra it's called The Way of the Creator. And he's kind of chastising his audience, and he says, free from what? Free for what is what I would ask you. Mm. So yeah, I think it's about having that kind of sense of purpose.
I don't remember that. Yeah, that matches exactly what I was trying to say there. Much briefer, because he was very good at prep.
He was, and anyway, I'm a big fan, but lots of people aren't, particularly analytic philosophers aren't. But there we are. Another thing I'd like to kind of pick your brains on before we all depart ways. Going back to the question, why do people condemn the inquisitors of the past while endorsing or turning a blind eye to the mobbing of contemporary heretics? We've kind of we've talked about people are afraid to put their head above the parapet, bravery, self-preservation, that kind of thing. There is, however, a particular kind of character that I've come across. I don't know if you've come across this sort before. So there's the kind of the unsophisticated woke apologist, critical social justice apologist. And the unsophisticated one will say something like, there's no such thing as cancel culture. It's only people being held to account for something or other. Then there's the people who say, there's no such thing as cancel culture at all. It's all completely a figment of right-wing imagination. But then increasingly there seems to be this other category that I'm particularly worried about. And this is the kind of the useful idiot category. And the useful idiot category will say something like this. Okay, cancel culture is real. It's a genuine problem. Here is an example of somebody who has gone through it. This is really, really bad. It's certainly happening in some places. However, let's put it in perspective. It remains a very, very, very small problem. And worse than that, this problem is being exaggerated in order to give cover for a much more dangerous far right. What would you say to those people? I don't know if you've come across them.
So I think a couple of years ago, I would have been pretty close to that position myself. I probably wouldn't have used that narrative of the slippery slope towards the far right, but I would have said, don't, hold your horses. Let's not fearmonger about cancel culture. It's not as bad as you might think. Yes, there's a few instances, but I would have been in that camp. And I've certainly come across a lot of people last year who have at least implied that in their conversations with me. Although, to be honest, most of the people who've actually been, because I was within my small country, a relatively high profile among academics, cancel culture target. So the people who have talked to me have probably been people who are sympathetic to the idea that cancel culture is real and is a problem. But I think there's a lot who have implied, either by their silence or by things that they've said to me, things that we shouldn't catastrophize. There's far more serious things to worry about than somebody getting unfairly dissed by a few students or unfairly criticized by their employer. But I think we psychologically, and maybe you could speak to this, Elizabeth, but I think psychologically, one thing that's really interesting is that because everybody wants to feel that they are moral citizens, we're kind of, all of us in some way, to some degree, addicted to the moral high ground. We want to feel justified. We want to feel that we are good people and therefore other people will recognize us as good. And so people will be silent out of fear, but will then try and justify their silence by saying, oh, but I didn't say anything because I didn't want to feed the culture war. That's just a silly culture war. None of us should be having any part of it. I think that's where I'm not sure if the useful idiot term quite describes them, but they're people who just want to keep out of trouble and they want to justify their avoidance of trouble with some kind of moral story that they tell themselves.
Yeah, and interestingly, just like you said, I've been told to my face, of course, that I wasn't canceled because cancel culture doesn't exist. Yes. Certainly not in my small university. So I'm the opposite of you. I'm sort of I'm a nobody, right? Yeah. Maybe I was sort of a somebody on my little campus, but I'm very much a nobody, and so therefore I can't be canceled, right? That the only people or entities, I guess the entity that was hurt by me pushing back was the department, my psychology department, and my university. They were hurt. I was unharmed, continue to be unharmed, and maybe sort of appropriating victimhood status, by claiming to be canceled. And I think that that's probably sort of the story that what I would consider my sort of friendly acquaintances at work have chosen to tell themselves, that by not saying anything, they were just staying out of it, and I made a big deal, out of nothing. So yeah, I think that I had never. Mike has sort of coined this, used this phrase over several conversations, this sort of useful idiot. And I hadn't really thought about it that way. But it is it is most painful, I think, when the people that you believed were, your friends, sort of engage in that. They're not actively attacking, but they're also not even, I did have one person privately contact me and say, look, I'm not the kind of person that can stand up and wave my arms and jump up and down and help you. But I'm here for you privately. And I respected that, right? And then a couple of people who, have somewhat more publicly supported me. But this is how I ended up connecting with people like Niel and Mike through other organizations like Counterweight. And like I don't have a social media presence, but, thank heavens that you do have your connections, through social media and stuff. And I know it's hard. It doesn't matter whether it's in person or on social media. You still have to block out some of the negative.
Yeah,
some of the
I do think it's important to recognize that those people who have reasons not to be public, but are still decent enough to say something to person. I think that's still extremely valuable.
It is.
It certainly in my down moments, I've thought, I wish they'd all gone public and said stuff in public that they said privately. But I still, nonetheless, really, really did value that. But of course, I valued a lot more those that were prepared to say in public, we've got this situation. This is a bad situation. We shouldn't let it happen again. We need to fight against this kind of intolerance and this kind of nastiness and so on. They are, of course, much more valuable because they are another kind of whistleblower.
Right. People who will, in a meeting, when somebody says something that's, inappropriate or condemning of, me or my situation, there are people on campus who will say, hold it, that's not right,
Yeah.
And so those people are appreciated. But I also, like you said, I also appreciate, somebody who's willing to support me privately, or sometimes somebody will, as opposed to the superficial, hi, Elizabeth, how are you? Sort of so let's just brush this under the rug. Let's pretend like it never happened. I have had a few people in the hallways of school approach me and say, like a genuine, how are you? I'm sorry that I haven't, reached out to you, but I'm thinking of you. And those are maybe perhaps almost relative strangers. You would consider them colleagues only because they work in the same building, or because I've interacted with them in my role as an administrator. So yeah, those are always nice. But I agree. We now have a endowed chair of free speech and expression on our campus.
Oh, right.
That person has yet to speak out. He
still
certainly spoke out, not at all, during the entire situation, and he still has not spoken out. Yeah. So it is. When it's your official role. Some kind of, now he's certainly been privately supportive of me. And I met him actually at the Heterodox Academy conference that Mike and I went to. Met him. Yes, we met him. Oh, that's right. Mike did too. Met him in person. Mike put a little pressure on it. I'm sorry to say it hasn't worked yet. So, I mean, the plan, I asked, well, what's the plan? And the plan is, well, I'm going to speak to incoming freshmen at an orientation about free speech. So that's, and that's not nothing. It's not nothing. Yeah. Right.
And is that an event that will be flagged up as a free speech event, or are you just going to slip it in there?
No, he'll just, probably introduce himself. This is who I am. This is my position on campus, right. Whatever. Because and students aren't required to go to an orientation. It's not like when we all went to university. Now it's optional. It's an extra day to drive to campus and park and do all that stuff. So, so some students, will attend. Some students will hear the message. Others will play on their phones and not hear the message, I guess. So I'm trying to channel some of my Niel Thin and be optimistic and play the long game in terms of that person who's in that position. But it's going to be frustrating.
I think there's another. I'm going to try another analogy that's just occurred to me here, because I think the difficult thing for somebody in your position trying to play the long game and stay within an institution that appears to have not served you well in recent months, you must be burning with anger and resentment, and to the extent that you were wrongly harmed, you are a victim. But there's a difficult balance, because you don't want to play the victim. You don't want people to you don't want to give people the pleasure of being able to say, oh, she's just playing the victim card. But there's a difficult balance, because you have to hold your head up. You have to fight for your dignity. You have to fight for a future. But you also have to, if you're going to be honest to yourself and to others, you have to say what happened was actually really, really bad for me, and it was really, really wrong, and it was really, really bad for the social quality of the campus. So the analogy I'm going to float is that I have 3 children, and I used to observe with absolute awe and wonder childminders who were able to manage an unruly group of children without ever losing their rag. I would throw myself into a bunch of children, have fantastic fun for 10 minutes, and then some of them would start really misbehaving in an incredibly bad way. And at some point, I would just snap and get angry, storm off. Childminders can sit there, do it for hours, and they can be really strict and they can be really rude to some children if they need to be, but they never give way to uncontrollable anger. And I would always ask them, and they say, well, the real trick is to you show your annoyance long before you're actually losing your rag. So if you can find a way of being calmly angry, I think that's the secret to long-term sanity in a situation like that. You don't pretend that you're not a victim. You don't pretend that you're not really, really angry, but you also show that you're calmly angry, that you're also thinking constructively and looking for ways forward.
I think we've more or less covered everything. So we've covered the victimhood seeking morality, how it's going to be awful if these people finally win. The useful idiots. I just want to be clear about what I meant by the useful idiots. I'm not talking about people who kind of self-deceive because they've woven some story that they've bought into and haven't reflected adequately upon it. I'm talking about the people who, and I do think they're out there. I think there are a number of them out there who are able to articulate what the problem is, and then give examples of it, and then say that it doesn't exist, even though they know their reason. I mean, I know a few personally, for example. I know some people who were very articulate, very well read, would talk about all of the problems with critical social justice, were very much against it. And then when the critical social nightmare really hit its absolute zenith in the aftermath of the George Floyd killing, then because the social pressure got too much, suddenly went in favor of critical social justice. I can't read good faith into those people. I don't think it's a very likely explanation for their behavior. And then when they then started to use their not inconsiderable intelligence to explain why critical social justice wasn't a problem, having previously thought it was, those are the kind of useful idiots I'm talking about. Finally, then, what I think we could end on, as somebody who's an expert in happiness and an optimist, are there any reasons to be optimistic? Please tell me so. If so, what are they?
Well, yes. I mean, coming back to our conversation about the pandemic, I think it's quite interesting to see different responses of different generations. Generations that have led very sheltered lives, of course, it was a shock to the system. But I think the generation that grew up before the internet is still kind of slack-jawed in wonder about how we got through the pandemic. Everybody made some mistakes, but we managed to reorganize our work, do a mix of working from home and working in the office, rethink the ways in which we work, rethink the reasons why we work. And that, I think, is a reason to be optimistic. And also among the younger generations, I mean, maybe this is naive, but I think they suffered incredibly during the pandemic. But I think they are already showing signs of, most of them, bouncing back incredibly well. We may see some long-term scars, but I see lots of, the youngest of my offspring is 17, so I see a lot of people of that age who their critical teenage years were ostensibly, objectively wrecked by the pandemic. The years in which they were desperate to be out socializing, they had to sit at home on their screens. So absolutely awful. Their school years were ruined, or their early university years were ruined. But they do seem to be bouncing back, organizing themselves, thinking ahead, being optimistic. So I take hope from that.
All right. Thank you very much. We will end the recording there.